especially in social media right now, there are all of these different categories for relationship status, right? We know about this. Who here's on Facebook? Hands up and keep them up. Who here does Twitter or Instagram? Let's add you to the mix. Emails, probably everybody else can get added in at that point. So we're all in kind of this crazy internet world. But one of the ways that people try to define themselves is by their relationships. I'm single. I'm married. I'm dating. I'm looking. I'm in an open relationship. I'm curious. I'm questioning. I saw a status this past week that said it's complicated. There are friends with benefits. There is divorce status. There is remarried status. There is everything under the sun. And I think that the fact that we could have that many categories points to how confused we are about sexuality and about relationships. We don't get it. If we need 75 categories to say where we are in life, we don't know at all. If we need that many options to find our niche, we're not sure how this thing works. And I think it's pretty evident. We don't know how singleness works. We're not doing it right, and we're not doing it well as a society. Hopefully we here are working our way through it to the best of our ability, but even those with God's heart and God's spirit working through it, single is tricky. Single is tough. And we're surrounded by a culture that's not even trying to do it the right way. They don't care about that in the least bit. So the temptations and the opportunities for us to make the least of our singleness are there when God wants us to make the most of it. Same thing with marriage. Our culture doesn't do marriage very well. We as Christians, hopefully with God's Spirit and with God's Word, are doing better than average, but we're still human too, and so a lot of times we make the same mistakes. We allow our flesh to overwhelm the Spirit. Jesus said, pray, the Spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Paul in Romans agrees and acknowledges it's a constant battle. So Christians aren't perfect, but Christians are forgiven. Christians have God's power. Christians actually have hope that God could do something different in us. But first it requires us to know what the heck this marriage thing is about, to know what we're supposed to be doing so we can shoot for that as our standard. Do you know what the standard is for your marriage? Do you know all the Bible verses on marriage? What is it that you're called to do? What does it look like in marriage? But then as parents, what does that look like? Well, I gave you a handout this week where I tried to do some research for you. We're not going to go through this handout, but this is my attempt to compile all the verses in the Bible on marriage, singleness, being a husband, being a father, being a wife, being a mother, being divorced, and what God has to say on all of that. But instead of speaking through every verse in the Bible about all of these things and being here for 6 hours, we're going to read one chapter where the Apostle Paul puts it all together and makes his points. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So I'm going to preface it a little bit, tell you where we're going, and then all we're going to do is just going to read that chapter. We're going to think about what it means to us, and then we're going to think about what it means for the gospel. We're going to think about what it means to the people that we love. But before we read it, I want to simplify the entire relationship status thing into only 2 categories. According to God, there are only 2 relationship statuses. There is single and there is married. You're like, all right, well, the Bible talks about divorce, though, and even in marriage is a time for separation is a way to work through things, and there's engagement. So, yeah, the Bible mentions these things. Why do I say there's only 2 statuses? Think through me. Think it through with me. If you're single, you're single, right? Easy enough. If you're dating, you're still single. Dating is not another category. Dating is single looking to be married. So if you're dating, you are single. If you are engaged, you are single. You are not married. You are single. All the rules of singleness apply to you. You are not yet married. But if you're married, you're married. You are not single anymore. None of the rules of singleness apply to you. You are now married. You are categorically different. You have switched from the one to the other. If you're in a struggling marriage and you're separated, you're still married. Separated is still married. If you're divorced, you're single again. Back to the rules for singleness, for God's purposes for singleness. If you're divorced, you're single. If you're remarried, you're married. If you're separated again or divorced, when you're separated, you're still married. When you're divorced, you're single. Every category is either single or married. And yet, even though God gives us these two polar opposites for it, we live so much of our lives in this gray area in between. I'm dating, so I've got a committed relationship, so I'm not really single, but I'm not married. I'm married, but our relationship isn't good. We've been separated for a year, so I think of myself as single. It's either one or the other, and whenever we're in one trying to live like the other, we're breaking ourselves. We're breaking our relationships. We're damaging the way things are supposed to be. That's not the way it's supposed to be. So what you end up having, in singleness especially, is people who are either preparing to be married by living together, by sleeping together, by putting bank accounts together, but they're not yet married. That's pretending to or preparing to be married, but it still isn't married. I've talked to many people that have taken that route, and guess what? When they got married, they still had to figure out how to be married, because in that preparation time or a pretending time, it still wasn't marriage. At any time, the other person could walk. You never had that commitment to know the person is there for you through thick or thin till death do you part. You never really have committed. So you're living together, but it's not marriage. It's still singleness, but it's the singleness that doesn't work. And often that living together doesn't work, so what ends up happening is then you end up marrying someone else, and now you have in your history these relationships, which were almost marriage, which you lived like being married, but you weren't married. And so now you carry that into your actual marriage, and now you live with that baggage and have to work through it. God would say, just be single, and then find the one that God has prepared for you, and then be married. Commit. Own it. Own your singleness or own your marriage. It's one or the other. Marriages go through tough times. Sometimes there's a separation. The Bible actually recommends that. Don't go straight to divorce when you have a fight. Take some time apart. But in that time apart, don't date other people. You're still married. If you're divorced and it's through godly reasons and for godly justification, and it comes to that sad, sad death of a marriage, God says you're single again. So use that singleness for what God intends it for, to the most of its potential. But you're not married. You're single again. How hard must that be? I haven't lived through that. Some of you have. To go from being married back to being single. How hard is it to be single and want to be married? How hard is it to be married and not want to be married anymore? None of these things are easy. I'm giving no easy answers. I'm just giving you what the Bible has to say about it. And if we can simplify our thinking into simply two categories, it makes everything so clear. All the gray areas which seem so confusing, they disappear. Because if we're single and living as single to its fullest potential, that is a beautiful, powerful season in our life. And then when it's time and we make that commitment, we jump in with both feet, then we're married. That season in our life, whether it's all the way or whether it's to a death or a divorce or a stop somewhere in the middle, that season has beautiful potential. And it can't be lived any other way than by committing to it, asking for God's blessing on it, owning it, and making the most of it. So my challenge to you is that if you are single, you will make the most of it. You will commit to it and own it and be God's single person with all that he has in store for that season. But if that's not where God has you stay, if that's not where your heart is, if you desire marriage, the Bible says awesome. But it's a different thing. And if you're going to be married and own it and commit to it. Give it everything you've got so that God can make the most out of it. The problem is when we're single but acting like we're married. Or married and still trying to be single. My money, those are my jobs, those are the bills I pay. That's my time. Those are my friends. This is my life. We do away with the oneness in marriage and two become one. And that changes our vocabulary, it changes our behaviors, it changes our attitudes. And if we live in marriage still trying to be single, all it's going to do is just ruin the marriage. But if you commit to it, the marriage can be the best thing ever. And the potential for that is extraordinary. So I want you to hear what Apostle Paul has to say. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to read through it. We'll take stops along the way to explain it, but it doesn't need much explanation. And as we're doing it, all I want you to keep in mind is whether you are single or married. It's an or, it's not an and. Single or married. I want you to own it. I want you to commit to it. I want you to make the most of it. for what God has for you in that season in your life. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul says to the church, to the Christians in Corinth, who, as Danny prefaced beautifully before, this is a church in the midst of a culture that's very promiscuous, very rich, very just allowing themselves to do whatever it is that they desire. He speaks this to Christians in that context. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, quote, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So they're talking about marriage. Is it good? Is it not? Should we? Should we just all be single for the Lord? They wrote to him. He's responding as a good pastor, giving them advice. He says, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, to be single, or celibate even. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except, perhaps, by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." If you're happy being single, don't let society tell you you've got to be married or you've got to be in a relationship. It's good to just be on your own, you and the Lord, and he's going to elaborate on why. But that's a rare case. That's not most of us. Most of us desire someone, desire physical intimacy, desire a partner. And that's a good thing, because guess what? That's how God made us. That's the design. The human species are supposed to mate for life, and they're meant to mate to procreate. It's part of the design at our very elemental level. So, if being single is just causing you to stumble, don't stay single. Find a godly man, find a godly woman, and be married. Because trying to stay single, when that's not how we're wired, is just going to cause us to sin and stumble and trip again and again and again. So, choose marriage. And then in marriage, you don't own yourself. You share yourself with your spouse. If you're in a marriage that is loveless, where there is no sexual intimacy, it's the same thing as being single. You're going to be forced to try to find that elsewhere and be confronted with all sorts of temptations to find some way to satisfy one of those important reasons why you got married in the first place. So marriage has to have sexual intimacy. It has to. It's part of the design for it. Because if not, then you find yourself basically like a single person again, wanting to be intimate, not having it in marriage, and then we have things like adultery. Then we have things like pornography. Then we have things like that creep in to help scratch this itch, which is part of us, which is good. So husbands, wives, care for your spouse in that way. Don't look out for yourself only. Look out for them. Share yourself mentally, financially, physically, sexually, in all those ways so the marriage can be what it was intended to be. A loveless marriage is like a torture for one or both. And that's not the way it was meant to be. It's meant to be a blessing, a satisfaction of the way we've been designed to be. So you see, he's describing here what it looks like to be married, and it's great, be single. But don't be single and just like chomping at the bit and tempted around every corner. Pray for and search for a godly man, a godly woman, that you can be married. But then in that marriage, live like what you got married for. Don't force each other into some kind of bound seclusion. You're tied together to this person, but it's loveless, and so you're alone again. That's not the way it was meant to be. Live it to its fullest potential. Enjoy the spouse that God has given you in every way. It's part of the reasons for marriage. Let's continue on here. So Paul says, now, as a concession, like I'm making an accommodation, an exception to the rule here, it's not a command. As a concession, not a command, I say this: I wish all were as I myself am. So Paul's speaking for himself. But each has his own kind of gift from God. One has one kind, one has another. To the unmarried and the widows. See, he puts unmarried and widows in the same category. They're single. Either you're unmarried or you were married but now you're widowed, through death or through divorce, widowed. I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. It is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. Paul says his celibacy was a gift. Contrary to how God creates humans, God gave him a gift where he was perfectly content being single. If you are in that category, God bless you. You're just like the Apostle Paul. Look what he did with his time. Look what he did with his gifts. Look at all the people that he loved as a father. Look at what he did for the church and how he served God. As a single person, unbound by any commitments to family, to children, to spouse, be Paul. Make the most of it. Love your singleness. And when people say, when are you getting married? You don't have anybody in your life? You say, God's just given me such a blessing in singleness. I love it. And I'm trying to make the most of it for him. Don't let the world tell you have to be married. If God said, be content, and you are content. But don't force yourself or remain single if all it's going to do is just cause you to stumble, sin, dishonor God, have more baggage or things you're guilty of or things that you're trying. No, that's not what God wants for you. Contentedness. Look at what Paul did with his singleness. Think of what you could do with your singleness. I remember before Michelle and I started dating, that was my late 20s, I had college and I had after college where I was involved with youth group ministry here at the church and actually down near my college in Pennsylvania. I had so much time you wouldn't believe it. I had time for all-nighters on Fridays and Saturday nights. I had time for camping trips every other weekend. When someone was playing softball, I was at the softball game. I had time for youth groups. I had time for boys' Bible study on Tuesday night and youth group on Sunday night and Sunday school on Sunday morning. And I had all the time in the world to spend however I wanted. And I loved those teens. They were just a gift to me from God, and I was a gift to them. Without even thinking too hard about this, I was experiencing what Paul was in that moment. I was okay being single. I was loving it. And I was using it. That's not to pat me on the back. It's just to give an example of what that could look like. What's your ministry? Where has God put you? If you're single, you have so much more time and energy to offer. But if you're single, committed to someone, so you're in a regular relationship, so you're like single but not, you actually don't have that time. You're single but bound. You're single but restricted. Are you single? Then use your time to God's glory to the best of your ability. But if we're living in this middle place where I have a committed relationship, so I'm together with that person all the time, so I don't have time for anyone else, they're actually missing out on what singleness has to offer and what God could do with it. But you're not yet experiencing the benefits and the blessings of what marriage could give you. So if you're in the middle, the gray area, I always say, just pick a direction. Pick one or the other. Pick singleness and start walking towards that because you're not ready for marriage, or you're not married, or you feel like God's got more use for your singleness. Or if you're in this gray area and you say, no, I don't feel single anymore, this is a godly person that I'm with, then commit, own it. Recognize what God has in marriage and what he could do for you. But you have to pick a direction, one way or the other. It's not an and thing, it's an or sort of thing. Because if we're single but not being able to take advantage or use singleness to its potential, then we're not actually benefiting from singleness at all. It's just a torture to us to not be with the person that God has given us to be with. But when we're married, when we have children, we know that slice of pie, picture your life like a whole pie, that slice of pie which is called free time goes like this. And then with another child, it goes like this. And then with another child, it goes like this. And with another child, it goes like this. And pretty soon, there's like a paper's width. And so then you have 10 things which would all be good for you to do. And you have to say no to 9 good things because you only have time for one. And so, Lord willing, you pick the one, the best one, and do it for God's glory. But because of your commitment to your family, you've had to say no to 9 good things. Singles, do all 10. Go home tired, sleep in your bed, wake up the next morning with a big smile on your face that you used that day to its fullest potential. Your singleness is a gift. Don't waste it. And marriage is a gift. Don't waste it. Commit to where you are, single or married. Make the most of it. Let's continue. Paul has lots more advice for us to learn from. All right, we got through the unmarried and the widows. So now we're at verse 10. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. He's speaking with the authority of apostle here. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. When times are tough, the first step is not split, The first step is separate, and we shouldn't even try to do that. Try not to do that. But if you do get to that point, when you separate, be trying to fix it. Don't be exploring your options on the dating scene. You're not single. You're married. Separated is married. Advice for married people who are struggling. How to handle it. To the rest, now I, not the Lord. So he's giving sort of culturally specific advice, how his take would be on it as a friend of theirs, someone who knows. So to all the rest, other than married, he says, if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. So your spouse being an unbeliever is not grounds for divorce. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. An unbelieving husband is not grounds for divorce. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved to them. God has called you to peace. Wife, how do you know whether you will save your husband? Husband, how do you know whether you will save your wife? So if a spouse leaves you because of their faith and your faith and not believing what you believe, saying that can be grounds for divorce. But don't seek that. Don't force it. It doesn't have to be. You hope that your holiness will draw them into the family. This is the age-old debate for people that are dating. The person I'm dating is not saved, but they're open to things of faith. Do I marry them, hoping that eventually they accept? Or do I split because I'm not sure if they ever will? I've seen both happen. I've seen people who dated that when they got married, they were just two different people. And I've seen people that dated, and through that dating relationship, one of the spouses came to Christ, and they grew. The problem is you don't know which one you will be. Don't look at the example of the one that worked out for them and think that that's guaranteed for you. You could just as easily be choosing something that ends up ending in divorce, that ends up being a lifelong fight between people of different faiths, or faith and no faith. You are not guaranteed that. So Paul is saying if you're married and you have a great relationship with your spouse but they don't believe, just keep loving them. You don't have to leave them. But if they leave you because of what you believe, you can let them go. That's okay. But for those of us who are dating and trying to make that decision, be careful. We're playing with fire because you don't know what the future will hold. That's where we bring in verses like unequally yoked. We are to find people that believe the same in faith as us so that we can be guaranteed to the best of our knowledge that we'll continue on in that faith. We continue. Verse 17. Let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. So singleness is a calling. Marriage is a calling. It's a mission field. It's a ministry. God has called us to these things. This is my rule in all the churches, says Paul. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. Neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commands of God. So each one should just remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a slave when you were called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a slave is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when he was called is a slave of Christ. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. This is reminding us of that sense of urgency that we're supposed to have. We talked about this on Monday night. There's supposed to be an urgency and immediacy to our faith. We do not know if we have 5 years more. We do not know if we have 50 years more. The end of the world could come tomorrow with a flash and a bang, and then we're all standing in God's presence making an answer. When we make long plans, sometimes we justify our sinfulness with the intent that we're eventually going to make it to the holy place that we're supposed to be, to righteousness where we're supposed to be. If we've got this long-term plan, well, I know where I am right now isn't exactly what God wants, but I'm working in the right direction. Well, don't be satisfied with not being where God wants you. And don't be satisfied unless you can just, to the best of your ability, be where God wants you. Live life where you are to the fullest. Single, slave, free, married, divorced, widowed, betrothed, engaged, whatever. Live that. Don't live as if, well, I know we'll have these many years, so we're gonna date for 2 years, and we'll probably be engaged for 3, and then we'll get married here. We're gonna do this. Hopefully, maybe. When we live like that, we more easily dishonor God in the moment because we think we've got the 10-year plan all figured out. Live with urgency to do what God calls you to do right now, fast, because we know it's right. So we should be striving for it and not putting it off. The long timetable just makes us too patient with our sin, when instead we should be cutting it out with a hot knife as quickly as we can. So we move on. Verse 25. Paul's got a lot of advice. He's long-winded. I can't relate at all. Verse 25. Now concerning those who are engaged. Okay, you say, well, I'm engaged. I'm going to be married. My mother's an example of someone who's engaged prior to being engaged and then married to my father. So she was engaged once, but it didn't lead to marriage. Anybody else have any family members in that same story where you think, oh, this is definitely the one, it's going to work this way, whether it's for us or others, and then it didn't? But we live engaged as if we're married. Oh, well, we're engaged, so we can move in together and we can put all our finances together and we just live preparing for marriage. There's no preparation for marriage, just like there's no preparation for kids. You can hold someone else's baby, but you have no idea what it is to be a parent until you have a child of your own. Same thing with marriage. You could live together all you want and share all the toothbrushes that you want, but you have no idea what it is like to be married until you've committed, and now life is different. And you're like, well, why is this so different? We lived together for 3 years and now we're married and everything feels different. Because you've switched. You've switched. You're different. It is different. It's not actually practice or preparation for marriage. It's its own category of just satisfying what we want without committing and owning. Single or married, nothing in the middle. The middle is basically just a travel path, going one way or the other. Dating and engagement to get to marriage, or in marriage, hopefully staying if divorce is that, but divorce is like kind of a reset button right back to the beginning. Single again. Repeated that enough. Let's continue on. Verse 25. Concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, the bad situation of our world, it is good for a person to remain how he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. If an engaged woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles. I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers, he elaborates. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, those who buy as though they had no goods, those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. A summary, much of it hyperbole, to make the point. The present form of this world is passing away. This is all temporary stuff, including marriage. In the packet there, one of the verses is Jesus' quote on marriage. Who is this woman getting married to in heaven if she was married to all these people? He said, heaven doesn't have marriage. Heaven just has this full spiritual equality and unity. And it's like better than marriage. It's this oneness with God, with each other, but it's not separated into categories. It's all of us together loving each other with all our hearts. So even marriage is temporary. Your marriage is for this season, this living lifetime season, and then it will pass away. So live for more than the moment. That's what Paul's saying. Verse 32, let's continue. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And so his interests are divided. This is not saying that's bad, by the way. I've had conversations with a few of you about that's kind of a husband's job to please his wife. Make it your mission to make her happy. That's your purpose in that marriage, to satisfy and to empower her, to teach and lead and guide and prepare and comfort and nurture and protect anything you live for her. That's good. But what it does is it narrows the slice of pie that you have unrestricted to use for the Lord or for others. It is right for us to live to please our wives. Husbands, if you're not living to please your wives, then you're not living your marriage to the fullest potential. And your wife is suffering a little bit because she has a husband who could love her more and help their marriage to be better, but you're not committing to it enough. Either you have enough of your own priorities or you don't realize how important it is just to please our wives. So important. So make the most of those marriages. Make your wives the happiest woman in the world. They would say, I have the best husband in the world. That's the commission. That's making the most of honoring this woman. And you think when you honor your wife, you're not honoring God? It's the same thing. We honor God by honoring our wives. Every time you do something to love your wife, you are pleasing God and honoring him by how you live. So either or, make the most of it. But if in marriage we will have less of our time to commit to the Lord's work because we are doing what God has called us to in our marriage. It's the way it's supposed to be. All right. What are we up to here? We were in 34. Let's pick that up again. The married man's husband's interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord. You recognize he puts engaged in with single. Unmarried or betrothed. So if you're promised to someone in that culture or engaged or dating, you're still single. Unmarried and betrothed. Both in that category. That woman should be anxious about things of the Lord. If you're engaged, are you more anxious about the upcoming wedding plans or about the Lord? If you're engaged, are you more anxious about the time spending with your person, who you hope will be the person, or with the Lord? You're still single, even engaged. Make the most of your singleness for the Lord because that time will be gone soon. Don't waste it. Don't miss the potential of your singleness. So to continue there, the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. Single women, this is to be your mandate. Desire to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. So same thing for you wives. If you're not making it your mission to make your husbands happy and to please them, to make them love their marriage and their wife, then you're missing out on the potential of your marriage too. Just like the husband's body is not his own, the wife's not her own. Husband should live to please the wife, and wife live to please the husband. So both are fully satisfied just loving the fact that God gave them a person just to bless them. And that inspires them to want to bless. But usually when someone's a taker and takes away, it makes us want to not give anymore. But when someone spoils us, we love to reciprocate. And it feels generous because it's mutual. That's what a marriage is supposed to be, both ways. Verse 35, I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks he is not behaving properly towards his betrothed, his date, his engaged party, his fiancé, if his passions are strong and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. Don't stay in the gray area. If you can't stay single, be married. It's no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, so not compelled, but having his desire under control, and has determined in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. It's okay to be engaged, but not if we can't do it right. So then he who marries his betrothed does well. He who refrains from marriage will do even better. He's actually still single. What does that mean? He can give more of himself to the Lord. So the Lord's kingdom is winning, or our blessings on this one individual is increasing. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. If your husband passes away, if you're a widower, a widow, divorced, you're single again, it is okay to be remarried. Yet in my judgment, she's happier if she remains as she is. He knows the joy of just being for himself, living for the Lord and loving his life. It's better in his opinion if she would just stay single. And I think, too, that I have the Spirit of God when he says that. He says, I think that this is God speaking to me. But it's not wrong either way. So you see Paul's train of thought? He's hitting on all these different categories. We're in all of these different categories. We know people in all these different categories. The best wisdom we could give to anyone who's struggling in any of these is to figure out where they're going to be and simplify it to two places, single or married, and have them get in that direction as fast as they can. And when they get there, own it. Commit to it. Love it. Find the potential of it. What can be better than having so much impact in the world for the Lord? What could be better than having a person dedicated, your own personal blessing machine, to love you and know you despite your flaws? They're both beautiful. And they both can be wasted. And I feel like we're wasting our marriages, and I feel like we're wasting our singleness because we don't know how to do either, and so we're muddying the waters, and we're just living in this gray area in between. Paul says, choose. So the last two things I'm going to say about this as we wrap it up. Music team, if you'd come forward so you can close the song when I'm done here. The last two things I will say is, after we've heard all this, apply grace. What's the gospel? There is a God who has truth. We just heard it. We are people and we sin, admittedly. God's grace is extended to all who turn to him. There is never a too late, there is never a too sinful, and there is never a too bad. There is never a too complicated. There is just, God, we need you. So for all of us, myself included, that have been either single or married and have broken our vows, either our vows to God as a single person or our vows to our spouse, who have sinned, whether it be sins in the single realm of our life, sins in the marriage realm of our life, there is grace. There is always grace. And God's plans for you are to bless you and to teach you what it can look like in that place in your life for his glory. So I beg you to extend grace to yourself for the places where you've broken this pattern, this design. I beg you, in the moments where you are now, to recommit yourself like a vow. Father, I pledge to you to make the most of my marriage. I pledge to you to make the most of my singleness, to make it a vow. Recommit your vows to the Lord or to your spouse and own it. The gospel of grace is that it's okay. It's not okay. It offends God. It's wrong. It's never too late to turn back to God. And so I challenge you, wherever you are, to recommit to God in this way. So that was the first thing. I want you to apply the gospel to this area of relationships for yourself and for the people around you. Truth, sin, grace, redemption. It's all in there. And if we preach this hard and we come down truth and we don't put grace in there, we're not preaching the full gospel. This gospel is good news in this area for us, so don't forget that. And the second and final thing that I'll say on this is Paul constantly relates our faith with our marriages, right? We've talked about that the last couple of weeks. Husbands with wives is just like Christ in the church. So for those of us who may be here this morning that are actually content in our singleness and making the most of it, or happy in our marriage and making the most of it, I would like you to apply this to your salvation. There's saved and there's unsaved. And in the middle is just urging us to get in one direction or another. And too many times we live our faith the same way we live our relationships. Complicated. Relationship status with God. I believe, I want, I think, I might. It's just as simple with God. Doesn't mean it's easy. None of these things I'm saying are easy. Don't let my conviction or blunt words in the least intimate that this is easy. But this is true. And a lot of times we're living with God without committing to him. We're dating God, but we're not willing to marry him. We're engaged to God, but we're still looking in other directions to see what else might be out there. Or we're married to God, but we're still living as if we're not. Which are you? You married to God or are you not? Do you believe or do you not? Are we saved or are we not? It's simple. It's the relationship. Either it's there or it's not. And hopefully we're working towards it. God leads us towards, so you can say, I'm not, but I want. Great. That's the same thing as an engagement. That's not a sinful thing. It's going in that direction. But while you're not, recognize that you're not. Let's not pretend to be married to God. Let's not be practicing. We'll go to church to kind of see what it's like. Commit and own it. And you'll find that the people that commit to God in that faith and own it and make the most of it, those are your Apostle Pauls. Those are the people making impact for the kingdom. Because they're not just dating God. I want God to heal me. I want him to forgive me for my sins. I want all the benefits, but I don't want any of the commitment. Does that sound like dating these days? I want all the benefits of it with no commitment. People treat God the same way. And he is not a date to be used and thrown out. He is your creator and the judge of your soul. So commit or don't commit, but know where you stand with him the same way you know where you stand in relationships, because it's a one-to-one comparison. So, like I said, all of this hopefully will connect with us wherever we are. For those who believe, for those who don't, single, married, and commit. God's actually called you to where you are. And you could be doing things in your season of life that no one else could be doing because of your specific gifts and your specific place in life. If you have children, no one else can minister to those children like you can. If you're single, no one else can use your gifts in the world for Christ's kingdom the way that you could. Single or married, saved or not. Commit. Own it. Choose your direction.